The leather of the chair felt cold against Sophie's skin. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a position that didn't make her feel so exposed. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall, each second stretching into an eternity. Her therapist's words seemed to dissolve before they reached her ears. It was as if they were spoken underwater, muffled and distant. She could see his lips moving, but the meaning behind the words was lost to her.
"And how does that make you feel, Sophie?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his eyes filled with concern.
Sophie stared at her hands. They were trembling. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she could give. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in, making it hard to breathe. How could she explain the tightness in her chest, the way it felt like a vice squeezing the air out of her lungs? She wanted to speak, to tell him everything, but the words were trapped, tangled up in her throat. The way her thoughts seemed to be running on a loop, always returning to the same dark place. Every night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. During the day, she would sit at her desk, lost in a fog, unable to focus on anything but the darkness that seemed to follow her.
I don't know, she stammered, her voice a mere whisper. It was the only thing she could manage to say, the only words that seemed to make any sense in the midst of the chaos in her mind.
The silence in the room felt heavy, suffocating. It was a silence that seemed to have a life of its own, wrapping around her like a shroud. She could feel it pressing down on her, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. It was the same silence that seemed to follow her everywhere. Whether she was walking down an empty street or sitting alone on a park bench, it was always there, a constant companion. It was a silence that spoke volumes, telling her that she was alone, that no one could understand what she was going through. She would look at her reflection in the mirror, searching for some sign of the person she used to be. But all she saw was a stranger, someone who looked like her but felt so different, so distant. Even the simple act of sitting at a table with a cup of coffee felt like a monumental task. She would stare into the cup, watching the steam rise, and wonder how something so ordinary could feel so overwhelming. In crowded places, she felt even more isolated. The noise, the people, the hustle and bustle, it all seemed to blur into a background of static, leaving her feeling more alone than ever. She would walk through the crowd feeling like a ghost, unseen and unheard. She would sit on a park bench watching children play, their laughter ringing out like a distant echo. It was a reminder of a time when she felt joy, when life was simple and carefree. But now, that joy seemed like a distant memory, something she could never quite reach. She tried to write down her thoughts, hoping that putting them on paper would make them easier to understand. But the words seemed to slip away, just out of reach, leaving her feeling more frustrated and lost. She would look out of the window, watching the world go by, feeling like she was on the outside looking in. It was as if life was happening to everyone else, while she was stuck in a loop of her own making. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, hoping that the act of breathing would bring her some peace, some relief from the suffocating silence. She imagined standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over a vast landscape. The wind would whip through her hair, the sound of the waves crashing below would drown out the noise in her head. For a moment she would feel free, unburdened by the weight of her thoughts. And in that moment, she would find a glimmer of hope, a small spark of determination. She would remind herself that she was stronger than she felt, that she could find her way out of the darkness. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. With each step, she would reclaim a piece of herself, moving forward with a sense of purpose. The silence would still be there, but it would no longer have the power to suffocate her. She would learn to live with it, to find her voice amidst the quiet. And as she stood tall, looking out with a sense of hope, she knew that she was not alone. There were others who understood, who had walked the same path. Together they would break the silence one step at a time. Later that night, Sophie lay awake, The city lights cast an orange glow through her window, creating a surreal atmosphere in her dimly lit room. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, a constant reminder of the bustling world outside, a world that seemed so far removed from her current reality. Gert, her elderly neighbour, snored softly in the next room. His rhythmic breathing was a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She had grown fond of Gert over the years. His stories of a bygone era, his gentle demeanour, and his unwavering kindness. Sophie had promised to look after him after his surgery. It was a promise she made without hesitation, knowing how much he needed her. She remembered the day he came home from the hospital, frail and vulnerable, yet with a spark of hope in his eyes. It felt like just another responsibility piled onto her already overflowing plate. Between her demanding job, her studies, and now caring for Gert, Sophie felt like she was being pulled in a million different directions. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the noise of her thoughts, the noise of the city, the noise of her responsibilities. She longed for silence, for peace, for a moment of respite. Her mind drifted to a fantasy, a place where she could escape, even if just for a moment, a place where the burdens of her life could not reach her. She imagined herself on a beach, the warm sand beneath her feet. The sensation was so vivid she could almost feel the grains of sand between her toes, the warmth of the sun on her skin. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm calming her racing heart. The sound of the ocean was like a lullaby, soothing her frayed nerves and bringing a sense of tranquility she hadn't felt in a long time. In her mind, she was free. Free from the weight of her responsibilities, free from the constant pressure to be perfect, free from the expectations that seemed to suffocate her. Free from the weight of expectations, she felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. She spread her arms wide, embracing the freedom, the joy, the sheer bliss of being unburdened. Free from the constant anxiety that gnawed at her. In this fantasy there was no room for worry, no space for fear, only peace, only calm, only the gentle ebb and flow of the tide. But reality always had a way of pulling her back. The fantasy would fade and she would be left with the stark reality of her life. The responsibilities, the pressures, the noise. But for those few precious moments she could escape. And that was enough to keep her going. Sophie took a deep breath and sat up in bed. She knew she couldn't escape her responsibilities, but she could face them with renewed strength. She could find moments of peace amidst the chaos, moments of joy amidst the struggle. She looked at a photo of Gert on her bedside table and smiled. He was a reminder of why she did what she did, a reminder of the love and kindness that made it all worthwhile. With a newfound sense of determination, Sophie got out of bed and stretched. She was ready to face another day, ready to take on whatever challenges came her way. She looked out the window at the city lights, feeling a sense of connection to the world outside. It was a world full of challenges, but also full of possibilities. And with that thought, Sophie smiled. She was ready to embrace the day, ready to find the beauty in the chaos, ready to live her life to the fullest. The California sun was warm on Sophie's face. The wind whipped through her hair as she drove, the highway stretching out before her like a ribbon of possibility. She had packed her bags on a whim, desperate for an escape. The road trip had been impulsive, unplanned. But as she drove, mile after mile, she felt a sense of liberation she hadn't realized she craved. The open road became her sanctuary, a place where she could outrun her thoughts, at least for a little while. The bell above the door jingled as Sophie entered the coffee and cream shop. It was a small, quaint place, tucked away in a corner of the bustling city. The shop had a charm of its own, with its rustic wooden furniture, soft lighting, and walls adorned with local art. Sophie had passed by this place countless times, but had never ventured inside until today. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingled with the sweet scent of cinnamon and sugar. The scent was inviting, wrapping around her like a warm hug. She could see the barista behind the counter, skillfully crafting drinks, and the display case filled with an array of pastries that looked too good to resist. The atmosphere was cozy, almost like a sanctuary from the outside world. She took a seat at the counter, feeling a pang of loneliness amidst the chatter of other patrons. The other customers seemed to be in their own worlds, engaged in animated conversations or lost in their laptops. Sophie felt like an outsider looking in, her own thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She had come here to escape, to find a moment of peace, but the loneliness was hard to shake off.
Rough day? The barista asked, her voice kind. She had noticed Sophie's forlorn expression and decided to reach out. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight of genuine concern.
Sophie hesitated, then found herself pouring out her heart to this complete stranger. She talked about her recent struggles, the challenges at work, and the feeling of being overwhelmed. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and all her pent-up emotions came rushing out. She hadn't planned on sharing so much, but the barista's kind eyes and attentive demeanor made it easy to open up. The woman listened patiently, her smile warm and understanding. She didn't interrupt or offer unsolicited advice, she simply listened. Sometimes that's all a person needs, someone to listen without judgment. The barista's presence was comforting, and Sophie felt a sense of relief wash over her as she spoke. As Sophie spoke, she realized that sometimes the greatest connections are forged in the most unexpected of places. She had come to the coffee and cream shop seeking solace, and she found it in the form of a compassionate stranger. It was a reminder that even in the midst of loneliness, there are moments of connection that can bring light to the darkest of days. Sophie left the coffee shop that day with a lighter heart, grateful for the unexpected kindness she had encountered.